There are killers who act in passion. There are killers who kill for profit. And then there are killers who poison with such casual cruelty, such calculated patience, that you begin to wonder if they possess any human feeling at all. Welcome to Dark Case Files. I'm your host, and before we dive into one of Victorian England's most chilling murder cases, I need you to do two things. First, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The stories we uncover here are the ones that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. Second, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. This story takes place in the industrial heart of England, but its horror is universal. Today, we're traveling to Ashton-under-Lyne, Lancashire, in the year 1886, to a modest terraced house on Turner Lane, to a woman who served tea and sympathy while administering death, to a case so disturbing that it shocked even the hardened Victorian public. This is the true story of Mary Ann Britland, a wife, a mother, a neighbor, and one of the most cold-blooded poisoners in British criminal history. The year is 1886. Queen Victoria has been on the throne for nearly 50 years. England is at the height of its industrial power, but that power comes at a cost. In towns like Ashton-under-Lyne, cotton mills dominate the landscape, their chimneys belching smoke into perpetually gray skies. Workers live in cramped terraced houses, work long hours for low wages, and die young from disease, accidents, or simple exhaustion. Life is hard. Death is common. And in such circumstances, a sudden illness rarely raises suspicion. Mary Ann Britland was born Mary Ann Tomlinson in 1847 in the village of Denton, just outside Manchester. Little is known about her early life, but by all accounts, it was unremarkable. She married Thomas Britland in 1866 when she was 19 years old. Thomas worked as a boilermaker, hard physical labor that paid just enough to keep a family fed and housed. The couple settled in Ashton-under-Lyne and had 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son. By all outward appearances, they were a respectable working-class family. Mary Ann was described by neighbors as pleasant, helpful, and devoutly religious. She attended church regularly, helped care for sick neighbors, and was known for her kindness and generosity. But beneath that pleasant exterior was something else, something cold, something patient, something deadly. The Britlands lived at 11 Turner Lane, in a narrow terraced house identical to dozens of others lining the street. Next door, at number 9, lived the Dixon family, Thomas Dixon, a cotton worker, his wife Mary, and their young daughter. The two families were close. The children played together. The women helped each other with household chores. Thomas Britland and Thomas Dixon sometimes walked to work together. It was the kind of neighborly relationship common in tight-knit working-class communities. But Mary Ann Britland had developed an obsession. She had fallen in love with Thomas Dixon. It's unclear when this infatuation began, or whether Dixon ever reciprocated. What is clear is that Mary Ann decided she wanted him for herself, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. In early 1886, Mary Ann began spending more time at the Dixon household, ostensibly to help Mary Dixon, who had been suffering from poor health. Mary Ann would bring food, help with cleaning, and keep Mary company during the long days when Thomas was at work. Mary Dixon appreciated the help. She considered Mary Ann a dear friend. She had no idea she was inviting a killer into her home. On March 3, 1886, Mary Dixon fell seriously ill. She complained of severe stomach pains, violent vomiting, and diarrhea. A doctor was called, and he diagnosed gastric fever, a common ailment in industrial towns, often caused by poor sanitation and contaminated water. Mary Ann Britland immediately offered to help nurse her friend back to health. She prepared meals, brewed tea, and sat by Mary's bedside for hours at a time. Thomas Dixon was grateful for her assistance. His daughter was too young to care for her mother, and he couldn't afford to miss work. But instead of improving, Mary Dixon's condition worsened. The vomiting became more violent. She complained of burning sensations in her throat and stomach. Her skin took on a grayish tint. She was wasting away before their eyes. On March 9, 1886, just 6 days after falling ill, Mary Dixon died. She was only 38 years old. The death certificate listed the cause as gastric fever. No autopsy was performed. In Victorian England, sudden deaths from illness were tragically common, especially among the poor. Mary Dixon was buried in the local cemetery, and life went on. Thomas Dixon was devastated. He had lost his wife, and now he was left to raise his daughter alone while working long hours at the mill. Once again, Ann Britland stepped in to help. She offered to care for his daughter, to cook his meals, to manage his household. She told him she couldn't bear to see him suffering alone. Thomas accepted gratefully. He had no reason to suspect anything sinister. Mary Ann had been his wife's closest friend. She had nursed Mary devotedly until the end. Of course, she would want to help. But Mary Ann had other plans. With Mary Dixon dead, she believed she could now have Thomas for herself. All she needed to do was remove one more obstacle: her own husband. Thomas Britland was 42 years old in the spring of 1886. He was a hard-working man, devoted to his family, and by all accounts, he had no idea what his wife was planning out in late March. Just weeks after Mary Dixon's death, Thomas began experiencing strange symptoms: stomach pains, nausea, weakness. At first, he thought it was something he ate, but the symptoms persisted, growing worse each day. Mary Ann played the role of concerned wife perfectly. She prepared special meals for him, brewed soothing teas, and insisted he rest. She told neighbors how worried she was, how devoted she was to nursing him back to health. But Thomas didn't recover. Instead, he grew weaker. His face became gaunt. His skin took on the same grayish tone that Mary Dixon had developed. He could barely keep food down. His body was wasting away. On April 3, 1886, less than a month after Mary Dixon's death, Thomas Britland died. The doctor attributed his death to chronic gastritis. Once again, no autopsy was performed. Thomas was buried, and Mary Ann became a widow, but she didn't mourn for long. Within days of her husband's funeral, Mary Ann began openly pursuing Thomas Dixon. She told him that they had both lost their spouses, that they understood each other's grief, that perhaps they could find comfort together. Thomas Dixon was shocked and repulsed. His wife had been dead barely a month. Mary Ann's husband had just been buried. The suggestion was inappropriate, almost obscene. He told Mary Ann firmly that he was not interested, that he needed time to grieve, and that she should focus on her own mourning. Mary Ann did not take the rejection well. Neighbors later reported that she became agitated, withdrawn. She stopped attending church. She snapped at her children. And she continued to visit the Dixon household, despite Thomas's clear discomfort. Then, on May 1, 1886, Thomas Dixon's daughter, 9-year-old Elizabeth, suddenly fell ill. The symptoms were eerily familiar: severe stomach pains, vomiting, weakness. Thomas was terrified. He had already lost his wife. He couldn't bear to lose his daughter too. Mary Ann once again offered to help. She brought food for Elizabeth, special broths and teas that she said would help settle her stomach. Thomas, desperate and exhausted, accepted. He watched his daughter suffer, praying she would recover. But Elizabeth's condition deteriorated rapidly. Within 3 days, she was dead. This time, something felt wrong. 3 deaths in 2 months, all in the same 2 households, all with the same symptoms. Thomas Dixon, grief-stricken and suspicious, went to the police. He told them about Mary Dixon's death, about his own recent illness that had mysteriously improved after he rejected Mary Ann's advances, about his daughter's sudden sickness after Mary Ann brought her food. He begged them to investigate. The police, initially skeptical, began to look into the deaths. They interviewed neighbors, doctors, and family members. And a disturbing pattern emerged. All 3 victims, Mary Dixon, Thomas Britland, and Elizabeth Dixon, had been cared for by Mary Ann Britland in their final days. All 3 had consumed food and drink prepared by her, and all 3 had died with the same constellation of symptoms: violent gastrointestinal distress, weakness, and a characteristic gray pallor. The police obtained court orders to exhume the 3 bodies. Post-mortem examinations were conducted, and tissue samples were sent for chemical analysis. The results were conclusive. All 3 victims had been poisoned with white arsenic. On May 12, 1886, Mary Ann Britland was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. When the police searched her home, they found what they were looking for hidden in her kitchen cupboard: a tin of Rodine, a common rat poison whose active ingredient was arsenic. The tin was nearly empty. Confronted with the evidence, Mary Ann showed no emotion. She didn't cry. She didn't protest her innocence. She simply stood silent, her face expressionless, as the charges were read to her. Her children were taken into the care of relatives. Her house was sealed, and Mary Ann was transported to Strangeways Prison in Manchester to await trial. The case caused a sensation. Newspapers across England ran lurid headlines: "The Lancashire Poisoner," "3 Victims of a Woman's Jealous Rage," "The Black Widow of Ashton." Public opinion turned viciously against Mary Ann. She wasn't just a murderer. She was a woman who had betrayed the most sacred bonds of friendship and marriage. She had poisoned her own husband, her best friend, and an innocent child. She had violated every expectation of female virtue and maternal instinct. The trial began on July 22, 1886, at Manchester Assizes. The courtroom was packed with spectators eager to catch a glimpse of the woman who had committed such heinous crimes. Mary Ann sat in the dock, dressed in black, her face pale but composed. Throughout the trial, she showed no emotion, no remorse, no fear, no anger. She simply stared straight ahead, as if the proceedings had nothing to do with her. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. They presented the timeline of deaths, the testimony of doctors who had treated the victims, and most importantly, the chemical analysis proving arsenic poisoning. Dr. Joseph Estlin, the analytical chemist who had examined the tissue samples, testified that he had found lethal quantities of arsenic in all 3 victims. The amount was consistent with repeated doses administered over several days. Not a single massive dose, but careful, deliberate poisoning designed to mimic natural illness. Thomas Dixon took the stand and described Mary Ann's obsessive pursuit of him, her anger when he rejected her, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding his daughter's death. His testimony was heartbreaking. A father describing the loss of his wife and child to someone he had trusted. Neighbors testified about Mary Ann's constant presence in the Dixon household, her insistence on preparing food for the victims, and her strange behavior after Thomas Britland's death. The owner of a local chemist shop testified that Mary Ann had purchased Rodine from his establishment on multiple occasions, claiming she had a severe rat problem in her home. The defense had little to work with. Mary Ann's attorney argued that the deaths could have been accidental, that perhaps Mary Ann had carelessly contaminated food while using rat poison in her kitchen. He suggested that there was no direct evidence she had deliberately administered the poison. But the prosecution countered that argument effectively. 3 people from 2 different households had died. The poisoning had occurred over the course of 2 months, and Mary Ann had clear motives. She wanted Mary Dixon out of the way so she could have Thomas Dixon, and she wanted her own husband dead for the same reason. When Thomas rejected her, she killed his daughter in an act of revenge. The jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes. On July 23, 1886, they returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of murder. The judge, in sentencing Mary Ann to death, delivered a scathing condemnation. He called her crimes some of the most cold-blooded and deliberate murders that have ever come before this court. He noted that she had killed without passion, without immediate provocation, but with careful premeditation and a shocking lack of remorse. Mary Ann Britland showed no reaction to the sentence. She was led from the courtroom as calmly as she had entered it, never once looking at the gallery where spectators jeered and cursed her name. She was returned to Strangeways Prison to await execution. Under Victorian law, condemned prisoners were allowed visits from family and clergy, and were given time to make peace with their fate. Mary Ann received few visitors. Her children did not come. They were too young and too traumatized. Her relatives wanted nothing to do with her. Only the prison chaplain visited regularly, hoping to elicit some sign of repentance. But Mary Ann remained cold and unmoved. She attended chapel services, but showed no emotion during prayers. She refused to discuss her crimes or express any regret for what she had done. The chaplain later wrote that in all his years of ministering to condemned prisoners, he had never encountered anyone as emotionally detached as Mary Ann Britland. There was a movement to commute her, sentenced to life imprisonment. Some argued that executing a woman was barbaric, that as a mother she deserved mercy. But public sentiment was overwhelmingly in favor of execution. The brutality of her crimes, particularly the murder of a child, had turned even those who opposed capital punishment against her. The Home Secretary reviewed the case and found no grounds for clemency. The execution was scheduled for August 9, 1886. On the morning of her execution, Mary Ann was awakened at 6 a.m. She was given breakfast, which she ate calmly. The chaplain came to pray with her, but she showed little interest. When asked if she had any final words or confessions, she remained silent. At 8 a.m., Mary Ann was led from her cell to the execution chamber. She walked calmly, showing no fear. The executioner, James Barry, later described her as one of the most composed prisoners I ever dealt with. A small group of witnesses, prison officials, a doctor, and members of the press watched as Mary Ann was positioned on the trapdoor. The noose was placed around her neck. The hood was pulled over her head. James Barry asked if she had any final words. Mary Ann said nothing. At 8:03 a.m., the lever was pulled. Mary Ann Britland fell through the trapdoor and died instantly. She was 39 years old. Her body was buried within the prison grounds, as was customary for executed criminals. No headstone marked her grave. Her name was added to the prison records simply as M. A. Britland, executed for murder, August 9, 1886. And that should have been the end of her story. But it wasn't. In the days and weeks following Mary Ann's execution, disturbing information began to emerge. Information that suggested her crimes might have extended far beyond the 3 murders, for which she was convicted. A local doctor came forward with records showing that Mary Ann's own mother had died suddenly in 1881, after a brief illness characterized by severe gastrointestinal distress. Mary Ann had been caring for her at the time. The death had been attributed to cholera, but the symptoms were consistent with arsenic poisoning. Similarly, Mary Ann's eldest daughter, who had died in 1883 at the age of 15, had exhibited the same symptoms before her death. The death certificate listed gastric fever, but again, the description matched arsenic poisoning perfectly. Thomas Britland's elderly mother, who had lived with the family briefly in 1884, had also died suddenly after a short illness while under Mary Ann's care. Another gastric fever diagnosis. Another potential poisoning victim. If these deaths were indeed murders, it would mean Mary Ann had been killing for at least 5 years before she was caught. That she had murdered not just her husband and neighbors, but her own mother and daughter. But why? What possible motive could she have had for killing her own child? For killing her mother? Modern criminal psychologists who have studied the case believe Mary, and may have been what we now call a comfort killer, or angel of death, someone who kills people under their care, often for attention, sympathy, or a sense of power. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist who has written extensively about female serial killers, analyzed the Britland case in her 2007 book, The Devil's Dozen. She writes, Mary Ann Britland exhibits classic traits of a healthcare serial killer. She positioned herself as a caregiver, gaining access to vulnerable victims. She used a method poison that allowed her to maintain a facade of concern while slowly killing her victims. And she showed no empathy or remorse, suggesting a profound personality disorder, possibly psychopathy. This theory is supported by witness testimony from Mary Ann's trial. Several neighbors described how Mary Ann seemed to enjoy the attention she received when caring for sick people, how she would talk in great detail about their symptoms, about how devoted she was, about how much they depended on her. One neighbor recalled Mary Ann saying, "After Mary Dixon's death, I was with her until the very end. She couldn't have managed without me. I was the only one who truly understood her suffering." This need for attention, this desire to be seen as indispensable, may have been the real motive behind her crimes. The infatuation with Thomas Dixon may have been less about love and more about creating a dramatic narrative in which she was the central figure, the devoted friend, the grieving widow, the selfless helper. When that narrative was rejected by Thomas, she may have killed his daughter not just for revenge, but to reassert her role as the caregiver, the one who understood suffering. If this analysis is correct, Mary Ann Britland was not just a jealous woman who killed for love. She was a serial killer who had been operating undetected for years, using the trust placed in caregivers to gain access to victims. The question then becomes, how many victims were there, really? In 1998, a historian named Dr. James Morton conducted an extensive investigation into Victorian-era poisoning cases in Lancashire. He examined death records, cemetery records, and newspaper archives, looking for unexplained deaths that might be connected to Mary Ann. Britland. He found at least 7 additional deaths between 1881 and 1886 of people who had been in contact with Mary Ann shortly before they died. All died of gastrointestinal illnesses. All were buried without autopsy. And Mary Ann had been present as a helper or caregiver in every case. Dr. Morton stopped short of declaring these deaths were murders. The evidence was too thin, too circumstantial. But he noted that the pattern was highly suggestive and that it is entirely possible that Mary Ann Britland killed far more people than the 3-4, which she was convicted. If Dr. Morton's suspicions are correct, Mary Ann Britland may have been one of Britain's most prolific serial killers, with a victim count potentially reaching double digits, but we'll never know for certain. The bodies were buried too long ago to be exhumed and tested. The evidence has been lost to time, and Mary Ann took her secrets to the grave. What we do know is that her case had a lasting impact on British society and law enforcement. The Mary Ann Britland case became a turning point in how Victorian authorities approached sudden deaths, particularly those involving repeated illnesses in the same household or community. In the wake of her conviction, new protocols were established requiring doctors to report suspicious deaths to the police. Coroners became more likely to order autopsies when multiple people in the same household died of similar symptoms. And sales of arsenic-based products, like rat poison, came under stricter regulation. The Arsenic Act of 1851 had already required sellers to keep records of arsenic purchases, but enforcement had been lax. After the Britland case, those regulations were strengthened significantly. Purchasers had to sign a poison book, provide a witness, and state their intended use. Arsenic sold for domestic use had to be colored with soot or indigo to make it easily identifiable. The case also sparked public discourse about the role of women in Victorian society. Mary Ann had violated every expectation placed on women of her era. She had betrayed her husband, murdered a child, and shown no maternal instinct or feminine compassion. This cognitive dissonance deeply troubled the Victorian public. Some commentators used the case to argue that women who stepped outside traditional roles were capable of monstrous acts. Others argued the opposite, that the restrictive nature of women's lives created psychological pressures that could lead to violence. Medical professionals began to study female criminals more seriously, trying to understand what made women like Mary Ann capable of such crimes. This led to some deeply problematic pseudoscience about female biology and criminality, but it also sparked more legitimate psychological research into personality disorders and antisocial behavior. The Britland case also entered popular culture. Penny dreadful sensationalist publications popular, with working-class readers published lurid accounts of her crimes. Ballads were written about the Lancashire poisoner. And for decades afterward, Mary Ann became a colloquial term in parts of northern England for a poisoner or a treacherous woman. In Ashton-under-Lyne, the impact was more personal. The community was traumatized by the revelation that such evil had existed in their midst. Thomas Dixon and his neighbors had lived next door to a killer for years without suspecting anything. Thomas Dixon never recovered from the loss of his wife and daughter. He eventually remarried, but neighbors said he was never the same, always anxious, always suspicious, unable to trust easily. He moved away from Ann-Britland within a year of Mary Ann's execution, unable to bear living in the house where so much tragedy had occurred. The house at 11 Ann-Britland, where Mary Ann had lived and prepared her poisonous meals, stood empty for years. No one wanted to live there. Eventually it was demolished and rebuilt, but even then, the new structure carried a stigma. Some believed it was cursed. Others said that on quiet nights, you could still smell bitter almonds, the telltale scent of cyanide. Though Mary Ann had used arsenic, which is actually odorless. In the cemetery where Mary Dixon, Thomas Britland, and Elizabeth Dixon were buried. Their graves became minor pilgrimage sites. People would visit to leave flowers and pay respects to the victims of the Black Widow. Mary Ann's unmarked grave within Strangeways Prison remained largely forgotten. In 1991, when parts of the prison were being renovated, workers discovered the burial area where executed prisoners had been interred. Among them was Mary Ann Britland. Her remains still there after more than a century. There was brief discussion about exhuming her remains and giving her a proper burial elsewhere, but the idea was quickly abandoned. There were no living relatives willing to claim her, and public opinion held that she didn't deserve the dignity of a marked grave. So she remains there still. Beneath the prison grounds, her bones mingled with those of other executed criminals. Her name largely forgotten except by historians and true crime researchers. But the horror of what she did remains. Because Mary Ann Britland's story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it comes wearing the mask of friendship and care. Sometimes it offers tea and sympathy while measuring out death with a steady hand. I visited Ashton-under-Lyne in 2024, more than 130 years after Mary Ann Britland's execution. I wanted to walk the streets she walked, to see the places where her crimes unfolded, to understand how such horror could emerge from such ordinary circumstances. Turner Lane still exists, though the original terraced houses have long since been demolished and replaced. Modern residential buildings stand where numbers 9 and 11 once were. There's no plaque, no memorial, nothing to indicate what happened there. The town has moved on, as towns do. I visited the cemetery where Mary Ann's victims are buried. Their graves are still there, maintained by the local historical society. Simple headstones mark the resting places of Mary Dixon, Thomas Britland, and Elizabeth Dixon. Someone had recently left fresh flowers at Elizabeth's grave, small bouquet of daisies with a note that read simply, "For the innocents." I stood there for a long time, thinking about what had happened to these people. Mary Dixon had trusted her best friend, never knowing that friend was planning to take everything from her. Thomas Britland had worked hard to provide for his family, never suspecting his wife was slowly poisoning him. And Elizabeth Dixon, 9 years old, her whole life ahead of her, had been killed simply because her father had rejected the advances of a woman. Consumed by obsession, 3 lives ended, 3 families destroyed. All because one woman decided that what she wanted was more important than the lives of others. The question that haunts me is this: how many others were there? How many deaths attributed to illness or natural causes were actually murders? How long had Mary Ann been killing before she was finally caught? We'll never know for certain. But the pattern is clear enough. Mary Ann Britland was not a woman who killed in a moment of passion or desperation. She was a predator who used poison as her weapon and caregiving as her cover. She was patient, methodical, and utterly without conscience. And she was caught only because she made one mistake. She killed one victim too many, creating a pattern too obvious to ignore. How many other Mary Ann Britlands were there in Victorian England? How many poisoners escaped detection because their victims were too poor, too isolated, or too trusting to raise suspicion? How many deaths were written off as fever or cholera when they were actually murder? The Victorian era is often romanticized, the era of empire, innovation, and progress. But it was also an era where death was common, medicine was primitive, and forensic science was in its infancy. It was an era where a determined killer with a tin of rat poison could operate with relative impunity. Mary Ann Britland's case helped change that. It led to better regulations, more careful investigations, and greater awareness of domestic poisoning. In that sense, her victims did not die in vain. Their deaths led to reforms that may have prevented other murders. But that's cold comfort for those who lost their lives to her calculated cruelty. This has been the story of Mary Ann Britland, Black Widow of Lancashire, one of Victorian England's most cold-blooded killers. A woman who betrayed every trust placed in her. A woman who killed without remorse. A woman who, even at the end, showed no sign of understanding or caring about the suffering she had caused. Thank you for listening to this episode of Dark Case Files. I know these stories aren't easy to hear, but they are important. They remind us that evil can wear a friendly face, that trust can be weaponized, and that we must remain vigilant, always. If you made it through this entire episode, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a case. And share this story. Help ensure that Mary Ann Britland's victims are remembered, even as her name fades into obscurity. Leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. Do you think Mary Ann killed more people than she was convicted for? What drives someone to poison people they're supposed to care for? Have you heard of other cases like this? And remember, the deadliest predators aren't always the ones who announce themselves with violence. Sometimes they're the ones who offer to help, who bring you tea, who sit at your bedside with a sympathetic smile. Be careful who you trust. Be aware of patterns. And never forget, some of the worst monsters in history look just like everyone else. Rest in peace. Mary Dixon, Thomas Britland, and Elizabeth Dixon. You deserve so much better than what was done to you. Your story has been told. You will not be forgotten. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, And stay safe, Doc. This has been Dark Case Files. I'm your host. And the poison of Mary Ann Britland may be long gone, but the lessons of her crimes remain as relevant today as they were in 1886.